Hi, everyone. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. For those of you who are here for our first opening panel, we hope you enjoyed our first panel of the day. And we hope you had a great time meeting people during the coffee break. And actually, if you're having a good time, go ahead and tag us on social media and say where you're watching from, because what we're so proud of is that we have such a global audience from over 50 countries attending. So we'd love to feature you under the hashtag FemTechnology Summit. Now for a brief introduction before we head to our first keynote of the day. When talking about innovation in women's health, there are many arguments to be made. There's the ethical one. Surely women are entitled to the same quality of care as men. But the fact of the matter is women are not receiving the same quality of care. Medicine is a house on stilts, pretending it's not a house on stilts. And I'm directly quoting from our keynote speaker when I say this in an interview for FemTechnology. She said, the hard work hasn't been done of evaluating whether we can actually generalize the decades of data that has been collected via clinical trials that were collected almost exclusively on males and best practices designed for men by men. Actually, there was a study that showed that around 90% of the time, women end up suffering worse side effects from drugs because these clinical trials were done almost exclusively on men. And I think we can all agree that that's unacceptable. Now, I said there was an ethical argument to be made, but there's also an economic argument to be made. Underfunding the study of women's health is a tremendous burden to the global economy. Women's diseases are dramatically underfunded, whilst 3/4 of the cases where a disease primarily affects men are overfunded. And there's no one better placed to talk about this than Chloe Bird, a senior sociologist at RAND, where she studies women's health and determinants of sex and gender differences in health and healthcare. In July, she will also be starting as Director of Health Equity Research at Tufts Medical Center in Boston and the Sarah Murray Jordan Professor of Medicine at Tufts Medical School. She served as Senior Advisor in the National Institutes of Health Office for Research on Women's Health and Editor-in-Chief of the journal Women's Health Issues. She's a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Academy of Health Behavior. Her current work includes a PCORI Engagement Award to bring together stakeholders to develop a patient-centered research agenda to improve maternal health outcomes in Medi-Cal, and the WHAM Commission study to evaluate the societal and economic impacts of increasing funding for research on women's health and healthcare, which is actually what she's going to be speaking about today. So welcome, Chloe. We're so happy to have you here. And without further ado, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. First, I just want to acknowledge my team who carried out that economic microsimulation model I'm reporting on today. Next slide. And to acknowledge that the work was commissioned by WHAM, Women's Health Access Matters. The reports and results are available at rand.org and at whamnow.org. Clinical research has focused more on men than on women across most diseases. Why? Well, there are historical reasons, including concerns about controlling for variables like hormone fluctuation when studying drug effects, and interest in avoiding pregnancy for interventional studies. But in the last few decades, there's been an increasing realization of the problems with the limited attention to women's health. These data are from an examination of the inclusion of women in clinical trials. And the bar shows that the median percent of women enrolled in all of the US clinical trials examined each year is below 50%, although it was getting closer in 2015. Looking at the results of those trials in the percentage that actually analyzed the data that they had by sex to see if there are any differences for men and women, you can see that very few studies do so. It's just one of many cases showing that females are not always included in research, and when they are, there's often little attention to analyses to examine and test for sex and gender differences. Next slide. The discrepancy has real-world impacts. For example, here I'm showing the difference in mortality for men and women in 1 year from a heart attack. The results are in red, the higher bar, and the mortality difference is not well understood. You've likely heard that physicians have a hard time recognizing heart attacks in women because their symptoms are different from men, called atypical because we study men. And the cardinal symptoms of heart attacks have been based on research conducted on men. There's still much that needs to be understood about how heart disease differs in men and women. To the right, you see another example. The revascularization rates following a heart attack are far lower for women. And it's not clear that this lower rate is appropriate in many cases. Next slide. Our team at RAND examined 4 different disease areas of interest to WHAM to understand the extent to which increased investment in women's health research could impact individual and societal outcomes. To choose the diseases, we looked at a few different potential disease areas and examined overall prevalence and prevalence by gender, and balanced those with greater impact on women and those that are similar in their impact on women and men. And what is known about the societal impact in terms of morbidity, mortality, and overall cost burden, as well as the feasibility of obtaining the data needed to answer our questions and construct models. Next slide. We created a micro-simulation model to understand the possibilities for the future. If we double what is invested in women's health right now, what are the downstream consequences for society? Our work from our colleagues in RAND Europe on societal impact of research innovation was an important guide for this work. It led us to assume that a 1-year investment can lead to impacts from years 10 through 30. So we allow some time for implementation and then looked at the return, only going out to the 30-year time horizon. We used National Institute of Health funding levels as the research investment benchmark, given the U.S. National Institute of Health's role as a major funder of biomedical and clinical research. To inform our work, we consulted with an expert advisory group of researchers, funders, patient advocates, and insurers, as well as the business community, to find out what they would find compelling. Next slide. We assumed only very small improvements, so that we were making very conservative assumptions. It would be easy for greater impact. The health improvements we modeled were a decreased age incidence of coronary artery disease, the disease I'm focusing on today, a slowed rate of disease progression, which reflects innovation in the pipeline now with disease modifiers, treatments, if you will, for coronary artery disease, and improvements in health-related quality of life. Another assumption we used was that $1 invested in women's health research benefits everyone, but it would benefit women more than men overall. There's reason to think that even the $1 invested in gender-blind research impacts men more than women, given historical trends. So we assumed a 3-to-1 impact with greater benefit to women as we start to learn what we haven't known, but men also benefiting. Next slide. So our conceptual model can be represented like this. The funding targeted for research on women's health is the input. And this is all based on US data. In the second column, we looked at the impact of funding. It's assumed to be reflected in specific health improvements from research. As I mentioned, disease prevalence, slow disease progression, and improvements in health-related quality of life. We were agnostic about the nature of the innovation, certainly with some assumption of disease modification from the research-based interventions that I'd mentioned. Those health improvements have specific societal impacts, shown in the third column, with more years of life, fewer disease years, and more productivity for informal caregivers. Technically, we're showing fewer years lost to disease, either sick years or death. This impact can be quantified in terms of cost, including nursing home costs and other healthcare costs, which are shown in the fourth column. Very small aggregate improvements were the basis of the model. We examined 3 scenarios. The first, a 0.01% improvement. The second, a 0.02% improvement. And the last, a 1% improvement. Now, we assumed in this, the results of reporting here, a one-time investment with the impact starting 10 years later, and then took a synthetic model cohort through the subsequent 20 years. The assumptions are generally quite conservative and in line with the rest of our assumptions. And today I'm sharing the results for that smallest improvement, 1/100% impact. Next slide. I mentioned that the informal caregivers lose income as they reduce or leave work for caregiving. And that means there's a cost to society for caregiving. In general, these caregivers are unpaid in the US. For our model, we needed to calculate the earnings for those informal caregivers that are lost. To do so, we decided to use an innovative model. Rather than embed inequity in the model, we took into account differences in wages and modeled based on white men. The solid red line is U.S. earnings for women by age, the solid purple for men, and the dotted for non-Hispanic white men. In the U.S., their wages are the highest. And we modeled it so that we weren't baking in current levels of inequity and undervaluing the work of women caregivers. This assumption allows for the future wage disparity to be reduced and avoids propagating gender and race-based labor market discrimination. Next slide. Turning now to the results. Next slide. Here's the impact on women. The returns for women are shown in green, and for men are in blue. And we see, got to enlarge this here, we see gains in life years, a reduction in years living with coronary artery disease, over 30,000, almost 31,000 years less coronary artery disease for women, another 10,500 for men. The gains in having reduced lost productivity of self, the patient, if you will. There's a slight increase in caregiver time lost. And that's because if you reduce disability, people spend more of their lives not in nursing home care or other types of care. And then there are gains from improvements in quality of life, so added quality adjusted life years. Next slide. Most of the gains are driven by a reduction in lost quality adjusted life years, or QALYs, followed by reductions in the lost productivity to self. Next slide. So here we're seeing, based on the US model, shockingly, only 4.5% of the NIH budget in fiscal 2019 was spent on research on coronary artery disease that actually focused on answering questions on the health of women. Next slide. What we find based on our model, using a 0.01% return on investment, adding another 20 million, doubling just that small bucket, we didn't know the bucket would be that small when we started, would produce $1.9 billion in savings, a 9,500% return on investment. Next slide. So in conclusion, the model led to a variety of results. That investment in women's health research can result in substantial savings in healthcare costs, a win from the standpoint of government spending and in terms of some out-of-pocket expenses, which are also higher for women than men, and come out of a smaller, lower incomes. We also found large returns on investment, even with these tiny assumed health improvements, which funders need to know if they're going to optimize the return on investment of investing in health and healthcare research. Our modeling approach can also aid with decision-making by funders and business leaders, as well as payers, to support efficient resource allocation. Included in that information is the consequences of innovation should be assessed proactively and ideally coupled with policy information, as well as caregiver productivity results have demonstrated. Next slide. These research investments for women could have life-changing effects on society. For example, lowering the prevalence of coronary artery disease can lengthen the lives of patients, improve the years of added life, and reduce healthcare costs. There are a variety of next steps we'd recommend. A number of questions remain, and we've just scratched the surface in terms of understanding the impacts on different people within the US. For example, among the questions we have, how does the caregiving experience differ by gender, race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status? Sex and gender are meaningful variables, but in the ways in which the variables are expressed in terms of downstream consequences of research funding are a function of many other elements of lived experience. In the US, race and ethnicity are two key variables through which the results need to be reviewed, and we would like to be able to do further modeling and analyses. Second, understanding the ways in which specific funding can lead to specific innovations and how differences in investment target can change the results found here warrants further attention. Third, I mentioned that the research funding will have consequences, both intended and unintended. Gains like those in work productivity may go unrealized without consideration of concomitant policy change. And finally, while we examined the returns on doubling the amount of NIH that NIH currently spends on coronary artery disease in women, my recommendation is not to stop at 20 million in increasing the budget. Rather, we should consider the potential for this return on investment by doubling the NIH budget overall and dedicating additional funds to research on the health of women. Thank you. Next slide. If there are any questions. And next slide. Our contact information. I'm Chloe, my co-lead, Lori Frank, and Andrew Dick. Andy is the lead economist in this study. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, well, thank you so much for that incredibly insightful panel. I think I might have messed up the schedule. There might be some people still mingling because of the programming that I did. But I'd love to ask you a few follow-up questions, which is actually, so you published this incredibly insightful report, and I was curious what reactions people had after they saw that how much money we're leaving on the table by not investing in women's health. Did you see a shift? And from what perspective? Was it more from like the venture capital side, from the startup side, from the researcher side? Who was energized by understanding that there's such a tremendous opportunity in terms of innovating in women's health?
Well, it's certainly led to a tremendous amount of interest on the research and policy side in how do we optimize investment, and perhaps more importantly, that it's clear that doing the research actually will pay for itself. I mean, we would be happy with social intervention programs that have a 200 or 300% return on investment. That they pay for themselves, right? And here what we're seeing is investing in research on the health of women can drive the economy. So we've had interest across different kinds of research institutes, policymakers, members of Congress, and WHAM has done more of the work talking to the venture capital and business community as it's led by Carol Lee, a businesswoman. And that's why she came to us with this question of what if we took into account, what if we evaluated the cost to the economy of what we don't know about women's health. And what we see, this is the cost of doing it wrong. This is the cost of not knowing well enough how to treat and improve the healthcare of women. And we have every reason to believe we can do far better. We modeled through looking at 1% returns on investment, which interestingly produce more than 100-fold benefit because of the ways the sequelae go through improving those outcomes, improving lives. It's also really important to understand that what we're looking for is not just replicating what we do in men's health. The models that we do, the clinical trials, focused on the youngest and least complicated patients, which makes sense for understanding a given disease. When we go out and treat men in the world, that is a Venn diagram, folks. The Venn diagram of what is the patient population studied and the actual world patient population look like, it's got pretty good overlap. When we do that in women's health, those two peel very far apart. Women have far more comorbidities and different comorbidities than men. So we're dealing with much more polypharmacy, much more complicated health and healthcare, and often over much longer years. So we need to do more aftermarket research. We need to understand how things play out for women.
So actually following up on that, right? I quoted this at the beginning when I introduced you, when you said medicine is a house on stilts pretending it's not a house on stilts. So we know that there's this tremendous problem, right, of the fact that women weren't included in clinical trials. And so then we know that the drugs that we're using on 50% of the population aren't adapted to 50% of the population. So what does that leave us with? Should we go back and reconduct these clinical trials? Obviously, going forward, we need to make sure that there's equal representation. But what do we do about the fact that so much of what we've based our best practices on is not adapted to half the population?
Well, I mean, the first step is simple. If we put the money in to do the research, looking at existing data, wherever we have data on sex or gender, such that we can reanalyze data and see, are there differences? We found in many studies, even down to tissue studies, that there were surprising results that were dismissed because they didn't work in men and it washed out the overall effect. But things did in fact work in women. So we need to go back and start reanalyzing the data, but we're leaving money on the table by not doing complete work. Research should end with telling us at the most basic level. And I realize absolutely not everybody falls into this binary model of male and female, but we're not going to understand groups that are in the middle. And it's not just one homogeneous group in the middle. If we don't begin with this basic division in understanding whether and how there are differences in treating men and women, either because the disease etiology or because of differences in life experience or differences in concomitant diseases.
And I may be going too much into the weeds and the details, and if you think that it's not appropriate, we don't have to go into it. But I remember you mentioned that you were gonna do an analysis of actually looking at, because you mentioned that in statistics, often we have to see, can we actually make the assumption to generalize it, right? And we never did that work for making the assumption that we can generalize what we learned with male rodents and with men, that we can apply that to women. I was just curious what your progress was on that study, and if there's anything you can share with us about that.
At this point, I'm just seeking funding for the opportunity to continue this work. Sorry, I don't have other answers. We have inside the WHAM work, we've looked at Alzheimer's disease, we've looked at coronary artery disease, and we've looked at rheumatoid arthritis. And we have another disease that'll be, the findings will be released probably sometime in the fall. And we would love to have the resources to go further. I did put in a proposal to NIH to do a much broader assessment of what don't we know and where should we look and how do we bring together expert opinion without just reifying these longstanding assumptions that what we're doing is good enough, which is the problem. It's not as big a problem that we're in a house on stilts. The big problem is pretending that's not true and pretending we know what we don't know. And time and time again, we find when we start to look, it's much more interesting. And if you believe that we get good and valuable research by studying rats or mice or fetal pigs, you have to believe that by studying women, we will find things that help us better understand human health, better advance human health, and are beneficial to men, women, and society as a whole.
Yeah, actually, maybe we should close on that notion. And I think maybe you could explain, Laura, sorry, there's two team members in the room, so the audio from one is now being reflected here. But yeah, maybe we could close on that. Really would be really interesting to know why you guys selected the diseases you did, to look at why there was underinvestment in those diseases, because I think there's like this notion of, exactly, because we're under researching these women's diseases, we're actually providing lower quality of care to men. And maybe, yeah, you could elaborate on that.
Well, WHAM has 4 pillar areas. So they're interested in different areas of medicine. Alzheimer's in the area of brain health, for example, coronary artery disease in the area of cardiovascular health. Rheumatoid arthritis is in the area of the inflammatory disease problems that are far more prevalent in women, and then also in cancer is the other area. So we chose diseases that affect a very large number of people in order to be able to model them with existing population data, and to look, where we would expect to have a large impact. And we looked where, in the case of coronary artery disease, we know now that there are differences in disease in men and women, and we've overfit diagnosis and treatment to men. Women are far more likely to have microvascular disease, which means the smallest vessels of the heart get blocked. And you can't go in and do angioplasty all over in the smallest vessels. It was long ignored. Or left as a garbage can diagnosis of, we ruled out everything, but you still seem to have something going on. Which is progress over we ruled out everything, you're okay, when it's wrong. And that still happens to women quite frequently. So we were looking at what are some of the diseases that have the biggest impacts in our economy, where we ought to know how they operate in women.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I think that really drives the point home, right? It's about creating better healthcare and better diagnostic strategies and therapeutic strategies for everyone. And it's just the fact of the matter that women have been neglected historically from medicine. But yeah, thank you so much for that fantastic keynote. And I think everyone should join me in giving a huge round of virtual applause to Chloe. And now it's time for our next panel. So I'm going to remove you, Chloe, from the screen. Yeah, so I think she more or less said it all. We're leaving an insane amount of money